migration strongly promoted by governments around the world, including, interestingly, governments which have not accepted democracy, of which the most important by far is the backlash against trade. Well, that's clearly a very significant one as well. There's some interesting reporting targeted on the poorest. The biggest problems of poverty in our country, as far as I can see, are in households with significant numbers of dependent children, particularly households.
And I would like to begin with that most fun and exciting of topics, Brexit, and ask you, how did it come to this? How did it come to the point where the choice at the very last minute is between a mutually agreed but very hard Brexit and no deal at all?
So the last year has been trying to work out whether a deal can be done which is sufficiently level playing field for the EU an insufficiently level playing field for Britain that they both can live with it. And in addition, there are totemic issues, two totemic issues. One is fish, because we're a maritime nation and people think we must get our fish back because it's a symbol of our being sovereign. And the other one that, of course, has recurred is how Ireland will actually work. So this is how we've got to where we are. And it's essentially because the fundamental trade-offs between access and sovereignty, quote unquote, access and autonomy, were never properly articulated and confronted. There was an enormous amount of many wish dreams in the Brexit camp. They never understood the EU position. They still don't really understand what the EU is about. Perhaps a parallel which will be easier for most people to understand. It's like saying, you have a wife, you have 5 children underage, you have a house together, you have a property, and you ask your spouse, would you like to divorce? And your spouse says, yes, very much like to divorce you. And that's when the trouble starts. Okay, we've had a 4.5-year divorce negotiation. And it's not very surprising if you're divorcing 2 economies that are so inextricably interlinked. We have done so much together for nearly half a century. We joined in 1973. This divorce deal is a nightmare. That's essentially what. And when we decided to leave the divorce, we didn't really think at all what this divorce deal will be about. So basically what we've been haggling about is the divorce deal.
Do you want to put your money on whether there will be one or not in the coming days?
A week or so ago, it did look very bad. We sort of walked away from it. But he believes in cliffhanger negotiation. He thinks he'll only get the best deal at the end. And I think that most people believe that Boris is sufficiently realistic to understand that the Brexiters will have to support him anyway because they haven't got anywhere else to go. He is their leader. And if he doesn't come up with any deal and we get total chaos in January and February, which is quite possible, he is going to be blamed, nobody else. And we've already had the pandemic disaster. And it's going to be very, very bad for him.
There's a new president coming in a few weeks. What do you think are his economic prospects? Do you think he'll be able to pass the kinds of social and tax and other policies that will help the US towards a more inclusive version of growth? And is there any hope at all that the Republicans will prove more cooperative with him than they proved under his Democratic predecessor?
I have been surprised, even I've been surprised by how the Republicans have behaved. I mean, it is the Republicans. In the last decade, a bit more, 12 years since Obama got into power, I just think they are driven now increasingly by deep ideological, emotional motivations, which are fundamentally hostile to the needs of the modern world, if I could put it like that. And it's got worse I used to think George W. Bush was a terrible president, and I think in many ways he was, but compared to what we've just had, I mean, he was a model of reason and civility and decency. So Mr. Biden won, which is wonderful, because the alternative would have been horrible. I think he's a decent man. He's an experienced man. He's obviously a bit elderly, but he'd probably be, by all the signs, well enough, we hope. He seems to be appointing by and large, a first-rate administration of decent, sensible people whom we will all like. The Europeans will all like. We will, go to a G7 or a G20 or a NATO summit. Everybody will be happy.
Not
because
terrified that it'll be blown up.
Yeah, indeed. But from the rest of the world's point of view, even I think the Chinese, I mean, it'll be so much easier to deal with somebody sane. Because his predecessor was a piece of work on every dimension. But his problems are, we don't know yet whether he will have a majority in the Senate. If he does, it will be wafer thin. I don't know whether they will try to override the filibuster, which will be very contentious. He will have an extremely hostile Supreme Court, which will be important. And many of the things he will want to do will be through administrative means. And I think this Supreme Court will try to attack the administrative discretion, the so-called administrative state in the United States. He has a pretty thin majority in the House. It's not clear whether he will be able to get his cabinet appointees confirmed. And it's certainly not clear that he will be able to pass budgets, pass programs which involve, as you say, significant taxes probably, pass climate change action, which is a big thing that he wants to do. It's going to be very, very difficult. And he faces an opposition which not only instinctively believes that its job is to stop government from doing things, but it also believes that if it can make the administration fail, it will win again next time.
Let's come back to Europe. It's been a tumultuous year, obviously, for the continent, the first year of a new commission. How do you judge the overall economic response of the EU to the crisis, including the general escape clause, the various programs to support employment and small businesses, but above all, the recovery fund that was agreed in the summer and finally sort of activated just this week after lots of trials and tribulations? How important will that be for the European recovery?
My general view is that Europe has responded to this crisis better than I would have expected. This is an enormous shock. And it's an enormous shock that has followed, as Greece knows very well, another enormous shock, though that one didn't affect everybody equally. That was part of the problem, namely the financial crisis. So Europe has been particularly, I would say, badly hit by these two successive world crises. It's probably been the region of the world worst hit by both, as it were. Nonetheless, my impression is that society normal people have coped with the trauma and difficulty of the pandemic across the continent. And I would say actually of ordinary people here too, rather well. I mean, it has had obviously desperately unequal effects. It has affected the less educated much worse than the more educated on the whole. It has affected lots of small and medium businesses terribly, but society has stuck together reasonably well. It's reminded you of the sort of strengths of European society. At the political level, it hasn't brought forth, as far as I can see, anywhere a bit more here than most, sort of mad populism. We haven't seen these horrific cultural wars over whether you should wear a mask or not. And then in economic terms, the national governments predominantly, initially, they vary again, have been pretty effective with supporting their citizens in very different ways. You can criticize every different program. And to its enormous credit, and I wrote about this very early in the crisis, the ECB's reaction was essentially they did in a few weeks what in the financial crisis took them 5 years to do. And I think that's been made much easier for the ECB by the fact that at this sort of crucial moment, the Germans actually sort of seem to have recognized this is an exceptional event. Nobody can be to blame for a pandemic. It's not like a fiscal deficit caused by excessive spending or all the moralism.
It wasn't caused by high pensions in the European South.
Yeah, well, exactly. We were getting borders closed. We were getting desperate pleas for help, particularly from the Southern Europeans, notably from Italy, which was so badly hit early on. I think Angela Merkel realized pretty soon that if they didn't respond in a very, very big way, this could be a really serious crisis for Europe. And that meant Germany had to act. And I give her a lot of credit for this. And her position in Germany, she handled it sufficiently well that she could get away with this. And I don't really care so much about the details of the rescue program, recovery program, isn't it? As the fact that there is one. It's such a powerful statement of concerted will to act together, will to recognize there's a collective interest which overrides national interests, and a will to solidarity. That the stronger have to help the weaker in a crisis of this kind. It has great symbolic power. And a lot of politics is about symbolism. It's about feeling you're not on your own. I think in the financial crisis, many people in Southern Europe, certainly in Greece, from my limited contacts, and certainly in Italy, which I know relatively well, felt that the North had abandoned them. Not only abandoned them, was set on punishing them. You can't run a union like that. I think the EU members have, in the last 4 years, so long after the financial crisis, had a sort of existential shock or shocks. They have realized that the world is not necessarily a very friendly place for them. That really important allies like the US and moderately important allies like the UK are not reliable. And they have realized that the new superpower is not necessarily friendly, and that the dwindling superpower to their east is really a menace. So I think they had an existential moment. I think it was very important for Angela Merkel. And they confronted, as countries, peoples, with a very simple question. Do you want this thing to survive or not? How would you feel it would be like if you were on your own? Well, the British have made their stupid decision on that. We'll put that to one side. But I think it's very, very clear that when it came to the moment, not all Germans, there's still an AfD, though it's declining, but the Northerners, for the most part, even pretty crazy Northerners, and certainly the Germans, certainly the French, decided pretty big time, we know what we feel in that situation. We have to stay together, and we must do what it takes to stay together. And I think that's been decisive, and the pandemic has reinforced that. So actually, I feel more optimistic, strangely, about the EU for all its terrible problems now than I've really felt for decades.
Now, that brings me to one of the trends that many people are talking about as something that will stay with us after the pandemic. In the EU, they use this term strategic autonomy to talk about the need of being more self-reliant on a number of fronts. And I wanted to ask you, and you've written about this, is this something that you see as having a lasting impact in terms of leading to meaningful deglobalization, or will it be limited to a small number of strategic sectors, and overall the logic of the most efficient supply chain will reassert itself?
We are in the midst of an really unprecedentedly rapid shift in the global balance of power. In 2000, which is only 20 years ago, the Chinese economy in market prices, actual dollars, this is not perfect, but it'll be best, was 4% of the world economy. Now it's about 20. There's never been a shift this big so quickly. China has gone from being a pretty small and irrelevant player, roughly the size of the UK, which is what it was smaller than the UK, smaller than Italy, to being a superpower. And unless something very strange happens, which might, by the middle of this decade, it's going to be the biggest economy in the world, biggest trading power, biggest investor. That's how it is going to be. And this is a bigger shock to the world than the rise of Germany. And it's a swifter shock than the rise of America. Basically, the Chinese have done in 20 years what the Americans took about 50 or 60 years to do. And that's changing everything. It's a fundamental attack on the hegemony of the West. And the West has been the dominant global actor, where you can define this in different ways, but clearly for many centuries. There are essentially three possible outcomes. One is sort of things continued as they were before. That, I think, is now over. That's not possible. The second possibility is what's sometimes called the New Cold War, which essentially means the breakdown of relations, the withdrawal of investment, the new trade barriers, and the emergence of a sort of pro-Western world and a pro-Chinese world with a lot of mess on the frontiers. That would be immensely disruptive. And there are a lot of places and companies and countries that will find this very difficult to deal with. So that's the segmentation. And the third possibility is we muddle through in a way that will be messy, but sustain enough cooperation and enough openness to preserve peace, preserve trade, deal with climate, huge global things that we have to deal with the Chinese, while intervening enough to give ourselves the strategic autonomy which you mentioned, which some politicians want. And I think that's clearly the least bad option.
The pandemic crisis has led to an even greater rise in indebtedness in Western countries, where lots of people are in tremendous economic pain, and where certain high-profile companies, which are arguably the big winners of the pandemic, like the companies that belong to big tech, are well known to pay very little tax. Do you think it would be possible to achieve a new social contract in the West without the richest companies and the richest individuals being again made to pay their fair share?
They will clearly have to pay more. That's another part of the big battle. My perception now tends to be that the sort of what you might call the plutocratic forces tend to be aligned in this world with the right-wing populist forces, because essentially they divert the people from economic demands to social and cultural demands. You know, if they can get white working class people to have a war with black working class people, then they're left alone. There is a strategy of some people, more or less conscious, to do just that, and it's worked. I mean, in Britain, you know, the working class were abandoned. Were right, and the Brexiters saw this and they are, of course, going to make it worse. And by making it worse, they will make them even angrier. And so who knows what follows? If this is what's happened so far, I mean, my concern is that 10 years from now, we'll have absolutely full-blown 100% fascism. The most striking feature of politics to me, and I'll give you here, this is not my expertise, so this is a hypothesis, has been the political disintegration of social democracy. The most interesting analysis of why this is the case, it's linked to what I've said before, was being put forward in an article and then in his book by, of all people, Thomas Piketty, who I never thought of as a brilliant political analyst. But I think he put forward a thesis which I find pretty persuasive. And I will explain the thesis, and it is, I think, the problem. And I think it would apply even it certainly applies outside in much of Europe and in North America. Essentially, the left of center political parties were historically an alliance of intellectuals and the organized working class. And it was very difficult to have a large social democratic movement in countries without a large organized working class, which was essentially Northern Europe. Now, the problem, I think, is this coalition is broken down. And it's broken down for three reasons. One, the organized working class is economically and socially immeasurably much weaker than it used to be. It's much smaller, relatively. The industries that made them organized, that employed hundreds of thousands of people and allowed the emergence of huge trade unions, have disappeared, with car factories and steel factories and all this stuff. They've all gone. Coal mines and the rest of it. Their economic position, relatively uneducated people who haven't been to university, has weakened. Trade has been part of that. And the unions have collapsed in significance. Not everywhere. The organized working class is disappeared. Their organizations, which are also social institutions, the unions have become very weak. And the members of the working class have become, I think, politically and socially atomized. And that makes them vulnerable to this right-wing populist propaganda. And the intellectual part is enormously expanded, because we've had this staggering increase in the university population. They feel very little cultural identification, if any, with the traditional working class, which they regard as backward, primitive, quote unquote, deplorable. And culturally, they've sort of abandoned them. Their interests are in public sector employment and in an agenda based around identity politics and equality, what I think of as performative equality rather than economic equality.